Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young, and it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Good morning, Bryant. It's great to have you here to talk about Starbucks.
Thanks for having me, Karen.
Which I think you know more about than anyone I've come across. And I am just thrilled by this book. It goes sometime back. A lot has happened since 2009. But it's called Everything But the Coffee. And it is the story of Starbucks and then a lot of observations about what Starbucks meant in the United States, but also elsewhere. And I'll tell you, it brought back so many memories for me. I didn't realize how many of my memories are tied to sitting in a Starbucks in one city or another, in Europe or in Silicon Valley or in China. So I think that that's one of the things that the book will do for someone, apart from being thought-provoking, is it's just, I hadn't realized how much it has been part of our lives.
Yeah, I think for people our age, right, we were able to remember the before Starbucks times.
Yeah.
The kind of thrill in some ways of discovering it and all of what it spawned. And then a little bit after it became a kind of behemoth and something that, aroused as much curiosity, some disdain, some trepidation. That's after, for my students, I teach at a university.
Yeah.
They don't have a before Starbucks story.
Yeah.
And I think that makes us uniquely qualified to understand it, both in terms, I think not just intellectually, but in terms of like a certain joy that it brought.
Yeah, it was, I remember the time I most loved Starbucks was when I was in the Midwest, in what felt to me like there was nothing I recognized. And there was this Starbucks. And you detail lots of stories like that, this familiar thing. And I certainly never felt that like that about McDonald's. I know some people did. But Starbucks meant something else.
Yeah. I also think you're getting at a really important part of Starbucks that will shade into third place. And that is it created a kind of continuity across time and space for a moment, right? That was reassuring. You're in the Midwest, right? And you've already developed this taste for a different kind of coffee. And there it is, right? You're in China in a world that can be disorienting. But there's that familiarity. And I think that it, in some ways, was almost a precursor to a kind of global upper middle class space that also defined the kind of people who inhabited it, right? That they were cosmopolitan and global, and it met that kind of moment.
And often aspiring to be cosmopolitan, right?
That was the trigger, right, for its growth, right? It sort of, I think I say in the book, right, Starbucks put itself in the way of what maybe not all your listeners will know of yuppies, right, of a kind of upwardly mobile people. And I think this was a kind of genius strategy, right? Get them on board. And then you really launch the company by kind of inviting and enticing emulators to adopt the brand.
Yes. And we need to be clear that Starbucks was much more expensive than anything else.
Okay? Oh, yeah.
So that premium didn't used to exist, that amazing premium that people have got used to. Tell me, so Starbucks fortunes really changed in like 2007 or so. Your book was published in 2009. So what were you led to write it because you saw a transition coming or something else?
No, I wish I was really led to write it because of an interest in publicness. I had written a book about Atlantic City, New Jersey,
Mhm.
in which I was really a book about race and kind of the making of public spaces or the
Mhm.
limits of that kind of public. And it made sense to me. It didn't necessarily make sense to anyone else, but at the moment I was sort of finishing that book, which really would have been the early 2000s, Starbucks was really taking off.
Mm.
And I kind of thought, well, okay, well, what does this mean that we have this new public space developing
Ah, yeah.
and that it's corporately controlled and conceived? Like I was sort of interested in that idea, and I was pretty I was kind of hopeful when I started.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't think the book is necessarily hopeful, but I was, here was something interesting developing. I kind of wanted to, in some ways, write the prehistory to Starbucks when I started this.
Mm. Yeah.
Like, what led us to this moment that this company was sort of encapsulating a kind of public, taking over for everything from libraries to kind of public centers to hotel lobbies. And again, what did that mean? When I started the research, because it was in the present, and you kind of noted this, but I can explain this even more. I did the kind of normal research you would do. I looked at newspaper articles. There weren't
Mhm.
really a lot of archives. Historians like
Yeah.
archives, but there were a lot of newspaper articles, and there was a lot written about Starbucks, and I read all of that. But I also kind of early on decided that I would go and sit in a Starbucks and see what was happening.
Mhm.
And I paired that sort of strategy with inviting people who I thought would have a particular knowledge to come with me and tell me what they saw. And that
Mhm.
included experienced architects, it included designers, coffee people, teenagers, my former students, people who worked there, who were actually often my best sources,
Mhm.
people who they
Uh-huh.
wouldn't take me to the stores they worked in, but they would take me to other
Oh,
stores.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And, they saw a lot. And so from there, the book kind of spun out into something bigger and maybe harder to get a handle on. And what I was then trying to write about public space was just one of the things. I kind of imagined the book as a kind of way to understand middle class desires in a particular moment, where those desires came from, and how Starbucks packaged them and also often messed them up.
Yeah. And so the book is not by any means entirely about third places, although your chapter on third places is certainly one of the best things I have read on the subject,
Thank
and
you.
really intriguing especially because I've you came across and I've come across people who thought that Starbucks or Howard Schultz invented the term third place. And
Well,
you really that story, yeah. What's that connection?
Well, I'd say two things about that. One is, well, three. First, thanks. And secondly, that was where I started. And I imagine that not just in the way it appears in the book, but really the spine of the book.
Uh-huh.
And in some ways, the most important chapter, right? Because
Uh-huh.
that was the highest value proposition that Starbucks offered, which
Yeah.
was to solve this big problem, a problem that Robert Putnam had written about in Bowling
Mhm.
Alone, that people felt disconnected. And I felt like Schultz and others at Starbucks understood that
Mhm.
and tried to put in place a performance to kind of deal with that. And I chose my words carefully there.
Uh-huh.
As far as Starbucks coming up with the term, I actually think this is way more than an accident. I think that Starbucks deliberately tried to own that term.
Uh-huh.
They deliberately tried to obfuscate its origins. I mean,
Uh-huh.
they would occasionally make a nod to it, but
Uh-huh.
Howard Schultz wanted you to think that he coined this term, and certainly that he was the most important person thinking about it.
Mhm. Wow. And since he's still using the term, even about drive-throughs, he clearly does want to own it.
Yeah, and I think that using it through drive through, and we can talk about it more, gets really close to the essence of what Starbucks was doing. They understood the desire that people had for connection. They
Mhm.
understood the desire that people had for meeting people who would create broader connections to the community. They even understood, as Oldenburg did, the importance of third place to politics and to
Mhm.
preserving democracy.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to do the hard work of making that happen. They didn't want to risk the kinds of divisions, arguments, and tensions that a real third place would have to have. And I think that's really embodied right in those community boards that I talked
That's what
about.
exactly
Yeah.
that I didn't know about that till I read
So
about it in your
so
book.
Starbucks
Mhm.
in the early 2000s, again, as it was really pressing the third place message, put community boards in the back of the stores. And they were like the community boards you'd find in food co-ops and independent coffee shops. And they would have signs about, band looking for bassists,
Mhm.
an announcement of a bake sale. But I think what was really important is they explicitly barred any messages about religion or politics. And and again, this is part of what Oldenburg is talking about, right? To the third place, and I think to a certain extent that Eli Anderson talks about this as well.
Mhm.
By bringing different people together, you have to bring their whole selves together. Their differences about politics, their differences about religion, and the idea is if you see these different people, you talk to these different people, you might come to understand them better. But you have to have that conversation.
Yeah.
And we can talk about the design of
Yeah.
the store.
Yeah. Yeah.
Starbucks was
Yeah.
never interested in that conversation, facilitated right through the person behind the counter who was there often enough to connect people that third place really implies. And that was also Starbucks understood part of a deep coffee house tradition, going back right to England, going back to the
Mhm.
Revolutionary War, that democracy, and I mean this little d
Mhm. Yeah.
democracy, is forged through disagreement. And community is forged through the bringing together of different people. Like that part, Starbucks sort of erased. But without that, you end up with a pretty hollow version of it. And we can talk more about the design
Yeah.
of the
So people
stores
would just
and stuff like
say, meet you at Starbucks, but it wasn't to meet. And I mean, for business, I mean, people were endlessly having business meetings, but the kind of meeting to talk, just to discuss something, to shoot the breeze about or talk about issues of the day. That, but
or to have a counter like a bar, right? In which
yeah.
a group of people are sitting and the bartender who is there all the time, who knows, there's three groups of people and this bartender knows all three groups and maybe will facilitate a conversation. It could be about sports.
A good bartender does that. It's
Right.
rare, but it does happen.
Right. And then the
Yeah.
bartender moves on to do
Yeah.
something else. And now the six people who don't know
Yeah.
each other are talking.
Oh, Joe knows a lot about that.
And the next time they come, they
Yeah.
recognize each other and
Yeah.
maybe they'll sit next to each other.
Yeah.
And that conversation might lead to, right, hey, you know, whatever that conversation
Hmm.
is, right? I, it could be a conversation in today's parlance after this last election about actual trans people, right? Not just a
Yeah.
right? No, but right. And,
Yeah.
and, now this person and they say, well, look, my cousin is trans and I'm really bummed out because that person got attacked using a bathroom. And then the person who thought this was like the horrible thing starts saying, oh my God, there's a person behind this, right?
Yeah.
I'm not
Real.
saying they changed, but
Yeah.
this is what Oldenburg talked about, right? Is that possibility.
Right. And you can if you agree on some things and then disagree on others, because there's enough, you spread, you're full people, and it's not just one or two topics to argue over. So you both support the same football team and you both really love this same coffee drink or food or whatever, but you disagree about something else. Just everything softens when you have that experience.
Well, and Oldenburg says it, whether, we could talk about whether we agree or not
Mhm.
with it, but he
Yeah.
says essentially that fascism, he uses the explicit example of German fascism, essentially rises on the top of the destruction of third place.
Yes. Yeah, you
And
can't have it. And there's plenty of countries where, I mean, China, for example, there's no way that you can have small groups regularly meeting. It's dangerous.
right. So, and then Starbucks, I think it's important also to recognize that Starbucks just doesn't want to do the work to facilitate this. They actually design the stores in such a way that
I'm really
make
curious about that because one of the things you bring up is the change in the coffee machines themselves. And all of a sudden the baristas are barricaded.
Yeah, I think two things about okay, so for Oldenburg, right, the person behind the counter, in his mind, normally it's the person who owns the store or
Mhm,
somebody close
mhm.
to that person. One is there all the time.
Yeah.
They're the consistency, right? And they're the connectors. Starbucks pursues a very different model of scheduling, which I think is important.
Mhm.
They schedule people when it's convenient for them, the company, rather than the
Yeah.
worker. And that means even if you go to the same Starbucks every morning in some place, you might not see the same person behind the counter.
Mhm.
That was true then. It's true now. There's
Yeah.
exceptions, obviously. We
Yeah.
can talk about those exceptions, but so that's one thing, right? They don't schedule, and and here I think it's important for listeners to think about. We are not just holding Starbucks up to an example they don't achieve. Starbucks set this up themselves.
Yeah.
They made the claim that they were creating third place. This
Mhm.
again, we're not just applying this willy nilly to them.
Saying that, oh, they should. No, this was their
Their
idea. Yeah.
claim
Yeah.
that they were making money off of, right?
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
adding value to their brand by okay.
Yeah.
So they put very little behind this in terms of scheduling of
Mhm.
workers.
Yeah.
If they cared about it, they would have scheduled some workers who had these skills at the same times every day because they would value this.
Yes.
Secondly, again, they are a money making operation, but they organize the work not around conversation, but around output. And this is about the machines. And those machines essentially barricaded many of the people behind these machines so they couldn't see anyone. Additionally, they laid out the stores in a way that appeared to offer third place, but actually cut against it. So just take one example, right? And I note this in the book, and I have been in these coffee shops. There were coffee shops in the early part of the 2000s and later that maybe had a round table
Mhm.
with 6 chairs. And they would put newspapers in the middle of it, and they essentially encouraged people to sit there together.
Mhm.
Starbucks built very small cafe tables
Mhm.
that allowed people to barricade themselves behind their computers and essentially to have private space in public.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what the stores were about, right? Because and even rectangular tables, right? Let's think about a 4-person rectangular table and just the sociology of
Mhm.
sitting. If
Mhm.
somebody's
Yeah.
in one corner, you might sit in the other corner. Now, if you really don't want to talk to that person, you don't have to. But it's pretty easy to start a conversation.
Mhm.
What you're doing? Can you watch my stuff for a
Yeah.
second? You know,
Yeah.
oh, that's an interesting book. What's that about? But that doesn't happen at a round cafe table, which you possess, and maybe the one person that you invite.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
they were very deliberate about that. That was a very deliberate change that responded in some ways to the audience's idea of what they would get. But again, they were advertising themselves as a third place. If they were truly committed to that idea, they would have thought about seating in a different way.
Yeah.
But they
Yeah.
weren't. And again, I'm not, I want to be careful here, right? They had an obligation to shareholders, to make the most amount of money they did, but they had no obligation to claim to be a third place.
Right. Because I've heard people say, "Oh, I talk to people in the line to pick up my coffee," and that's the most interaction that you get because it doesn't. Yeah, the setting, even if people are hanging out there. So
I think it's
yeah,
important to note. I mean,
hmm
we can
hmm
talk more about it,
yeah,
but
yeah,
and again, people do find third place in Starbucks.
hmm
There are groups of people that I talk to, older people who are retired, who went the same time every day and created friend
hmm
networks.
hmm
Moms in the middle of the morning, students.
Yeah. So they made use of it. And actually I think that's one of the things people are interested. How could I kind of work with what I got and make a third place happen anyway. So actually it's not a bad model. But you're I think you may be the first person I've come across who actually went and interviewed Ray. Um and I'm, really curious about that. I corresponded with him for 20 years and finally went and met him spent time with him. But it took me 20 years to do it. And you did it. And I think you learned things that I think you were certainly there before I was. So you learned things that maybe I just didn't think to ask him about. I didn't ask him about his experience with Starbucks, for example. So please do tell me
Yeah,
about
so
that.
I'll show you. I went and found my notes.
Yay.
Um and according to my notes, we met at on June 28th in 2005 at 7 a.m. at
Yep, that's Ray's time.
not at a Starbucks,
Yeah.
at a place that he frequented called the Village Inn. It was a breakfast place.
hmm
And we had breakfast. And he told me, I have this in my book, but one of the first things he told me was that Starbucks came to him to ask him about third place. And he told this pretty funny story about a Starbucks executive had him in a limousine and started to lecture him about what third place really was. Uh, and and I think that what he kind of emphasized was that Starbucks he his analysis was kind of fit with what I thought. Like, he wasn't willing to dismiss it. He thought there was something
hmm
interesting
hmm
there, but he did think that it was kind of a like that because it was corporately conceived, it couldn't do the things he thought a third place should do. And it didn't fit his model at all. And he ended up not working for Starbucks. I think it's probably important. He said that they sort of offered to hire him as a consultant. He didn't want to do it. And I think in general, right, he was wary. I have this line, he told me that he talked about the corporate colonization of the public realm. And
hmm
so he was very leery of corporations being able to act as third places, and he saw the advance of sameness and of corporations as a possible threat to this idea that he had. He believed that, as he said to me, that mom and pops were ultimately the best kind of version of
hmm
this, in part because of their commitment to it, but also the fact that they were the connectors.
hmm
I actually discovered these notes that I think are pretty interesting. He pointed to a couple of things that he thought were kind of interest. I don't know. I have a note here. I don't know how you think about this. He came off a little curmudgeonly.
hmm
Both in a charming way, but also in a way that he was. And I think the book comes off a little bit this way of kind of venerating a past, right? It's
Yeah.
slightly nostalgic, and he
Yeah.
came off not as warmly nostalgic, but as sort of a little more edgily nostalgic. But he said two things that I mean, one is he talked a lot about the tavern being like the really important
Mhm,
example of a
mhm,
third place, and he said it was threatened by two things. He told me one was, remember, he's in kind of Florida at this point. He
mhm.
said one was commuting,
Yeah,
that people they spent so much time in their cars, right, that they didn't have time to stop at the tavern anymore.
yeah.
And secondly, I thought this was kind of interesting. He blamed a new kind of health consciousness.
Oh.
Um, I mean, I have this note, like he said that, and in this health consciousness that was, and I think he's a little early on this, right? Actually,
Mhm,
recently it is true that people were drinking less and replacing this with Starbucks.
mhm.
But it is true, right? Drink can facilitate conversation. And
Yeah.
so I thought that was pretty interesting. And he had one other line that I think that he talked about with some disdain, was that brands and corporations privilege safety above all else for the
Mhm,
consumer. And that's true about Starbucks, right? That sitting by yourself is an example of it. And that safety got in the way of talking to and meeting strangers, right? That
mhm.
strangers increasingly were defined as dangerous. And if you embodied safety, then you took away the possibility for that risk. I thought that was a kind of interesting
Yeah,
insight.
and it's sort of safety on a physical level, but it's safety just in terms of your outlook. And one of the things I so love about the original book is that Ray kept over and over again emphasizing the fun that comes from the unpredictability of real third place. You don't know what's going to happen. And yes, some of it you might get roasted by someone. You might hear things you don't, but it's exciting and unpredictable. And
Right.
life is, it's not boring. Even if it's, even if somebody's boring, he didn't actually like bores. He was like, he had his, he was well aware that there's some people who you'd rather not hear too much from. And that there was a kind of obligation either to keep your mouth shut or to entertain.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. And think about where we started this conversation, and that one of the things that Starbucks sold, another chapter in my book, is predictability. That
Yes.
particularly people traveling, and I say this in the book, people who are weary in a moment of urban kind of crisis of strangers, right? They want protection and safety. And Starbucks understood that, further embodied in those
Mm-hmm.
tables.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's a tension between that predictability and third place. And I thought, so the last thing I have
Mm-hmm.
written down that he told me was, he said Starbucks was better than nothing. And then he added, Starbucks can't achieve the kinds of things I had in mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and I think that, right, that is probably right. That is a kind of subtle analysis that, I was trying to achieve in the book. And I think a sociologist kind of naturally achieves, but that popular analysis rarely does, right? That tension,
Mm-hmm.
right? Doesn't,
Yeah.
you're not getting that in a Washington Post article. So most of the
Yeah.
articles about third place and about Starbucks are like, is it or isn't it?
Right.
and,
Right.
and,
Yeah.
I think that's too simple. It's too fundamental of a desire, too important of a kind of achievement to just dismiss with yes or no.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that has kind of made me a little more sympathetic to Schultz. It's a big company, but he clearly had the concept in mind. He was visualizing something that he'd seen in Italy and understood was desirable and that people wanted. I mean, he was grasping that. The fact that it turned into this corporate behemoth that kind of that couldn't accomplish that is a different story. But the question, I mean, it does leave us with questions now. These coffee shops are, the chairs and tables are being taken away. People, what's going to bring people back? How have people's needs changed? I find that Americans will say, oh, there aren't any third places anymore. They lament it, but they think that it's no longer possible. And yet, I go and talk to people in other countries and they certainly do exist. So, I mean, there is a question there. Is there any potential for Starbucks or any kind of chain to offer that? Or do we need something else and some approach that's still economically viable?
I mean, it's an interesting question. And I think we'll get back to what we were just talking
Yeah.
about for a second is
Uh-huh.
that Starbucks' success and Starbucks' kind of struggles right now are in part the product of a similar phenomenon, and that is that people are contradictory.
Yeah.
And so, yes, people will say they want meeting places, and then they'll say, well, but I really want to get my coffee as quick as possible. People will say that they wish they had comfortable places to sit and they had more community, but they're in a hurry. And so I I think that however genuine or not genuine Howard Schultz was, he was selling something that wasn't so much about the product, but about people's desires. And that meant constantly, right, dealing with the contradictions of desire, right? I want
Yeah.
predictability. I want to be insulated from risk when I want to get out of my house. I want to be in public, but I want to be insulated from the risks of people I don't know. Those are
But I
hard things to
also would
reconcile.
like to have lively, fun conversations
Yeah.
that are
You
just,
know, I,
inspiring.
I want to have real conversations with people. And I think this is increasingly true, but I'm not going to talk about politics because that, right.
Right.
No, but I mean, right. And so I, I think that Howard Schultz kind of genius was that for a moment, I don't know that I think this is true today, but for a moment, I think he grasped what middle and upper middle class Americans wanted better than they maybe understood
Mhm.
themselves. But again and again, he faced a conflict, right, about profit. And almost every time he went for the profit part, right?
Yeah.
And
The quarterly results.
yeah, and he was being so you talked about the drive-throughs, right? And the no chairs. Well, having chairs, having bathrooms, having places for people to sit mean allocating someone to take care of them. That means maybe less speed behind the line. It means conflict over how long people are going to sit at the table and how people are going to use the bathrooms. That just became too expensive. And I mean, you can see this right now, right? There's a real tension between people want deeply embellished drinks. That is true in the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah.
They take longer. And so then people complain that the drinks take so long, right?
Right.
And, dealing with those things are really complicated.
I read that there are a couple of changes that I guess the new CEO, after visiting many stores, planned to do was somehow simplify the menu, but
Yeah.
also to deal with the complaint about Starbucks being less personal,
Yeah.
to start writing people's names on the cups again, because that was the cute thing when
Yeah.
they would write. And it made me think of Cheers and the line, everyone, where everyone knows your name. And so I sometimes feel nowadays people think if someone just uses my name, at least it's some set, how have we come to the point that simply writing your name on a cup would be a sign of human connection?
Well, if you really think about when Starbucks breaks, it's at the moment of a kind of another intense wave of suburbanization, of gated communities, of driving Hummers, right? Urban
Mhm.
assault
Yeah.
vehicles through the
Yeah.
city. It's in the wake of the Los Angeles riot,
Uh-huh.
rebellion, right? People are both afraid of the public and dissatisfied with how they can meet people. I mean, here I think Robert
Yeah.
Putnam's right in Bowling Alone, and I think that Starbucks does a couple of things, and they're in lockstep with the third place proposition. They offer a kind of belonging, and that belonging comes through the creation of its own language. People mock that all the time, and that's because they misunderstood why it was important.
Oh,
Yeah,
the grande thing.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, in order to be included, you had to master that language.
And
The people
I have
behind the counter,
refused all my life to use it. I've
yeah,
said, I want a small.
right, because you don't care to belong to that brand, but right,
But
but
yeah,
I tell the story in my book of meeting people who were practicing their orders. There were websites that taught you how to order. This will tell you like that
yeah,
value.
yeah,
And the elaborate drink was part of it. It was that there was a drink that was yours. And having your name called out in association with that drink was a kind of affirmation. It all worked together,
right.
right?
Especially if the barista remembers your drink. This
Yeah,
is your particular, yeah,
and as I said, I someone showed me the kind of internal surveying that the company did, and they would evaluate the baristas based on not just their competency, but their kind of desire to make a connection. Go
uh-huh,
back to our earlier conversation, but if your goal is to speed up the line, the person behind you doesn't want to hear this conversation. They want to like take the damn order, get it made, and get to me, right? I'm
yeah,
late for a meeting. And
yeah,
so again, this is like this tension that Starbucks. So if you move, and people told them this, they wanted their drinks faster. So if you move the company in the interest of speed, you lose even that little connection.
yeah.
And it is a very difficult and complicated needle to thread.
But so what justifies the price then today? If you're not getting, if you're rushing in and out, that's what I wonder. And is that why McDonald's and whoever else, Dunkin' Donuts, is able to compete? Because Starbucks doesn't is both more expensive and that the kind of connection experience is much less obvious, or it's just more obvious that it's not there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto it, right? That Starbucks creates this mass market, right?
Mhm.
And everyone's like, "Huh, I can get a piece." And I think part of you asked me like in 2008, there's a lot of companies and a lot of different entities, big and small, taking little pieces out of Starbucks.
Mhm.
And so, you have 2008, 2009, you have Better Coffee, a
Yeah.
Better Coffee story, taking a piece at the high end,
Mhm.
right? Single origin, pour
Mhm.
over,
Yeah.
small batch, right? At the lower end, or at the middling, you got McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts just saying, look, we can do this faster, we can make it more, we can take some of the parts that really bug me out of it, like
Mhm.
the person on the laptop who isn't working. We can flatten the taste, which is a lot of what they did, right?
Right.
And so they begin to sort of pull. And if you're not getting a kind of big cultural bang for your buck anymore for Starbucks, some of the value is bled out, right? And so I think that Starbucks found itself as it got bigger in a kind of obvious ways, being assaulted from all fronts. It, but it had won the biggest argument of all that all of these companies benefit from, and that is basically raising the price of coffee.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I don't know that price is killing them necessarily, right? Because for the really deeply embellished drinks, they still are able to charge a lot. I think
Mhm.
they got hit on the lower end. The higher end, they were going to lose that anyways, right? They could,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
they make a few gestures to it with these signature stores,
Yeah.
but you know I think more importantly for Starbucks, right, and I think they were smart about this, is that when they realized that they were no longer a BMW, but they were kind of like, a Ford or a Chevy, right?
Uh-huh.
Or, the
Yeah.
Gap. they made a kind of obvious play, like to go to every airport, to every rest stop, to every lobby of a student center at a university, right? To go on to the shelves of supermarkets, that they would sort of down market the brand and try not to slip all the way to McDonald's. And that
And
was the
more
danger.
sugar, is that true? Until I read your book, I didn't know why. So this is where the history comes in. I remember a point when suddenly it was really hard to find dark roast beef
Yeah.
at a Starbucks store. It was all of a sudden, it was all this blonde stuff. And I was like, who wants this stuff?
Yeah.
I had a partner who was devoted to their French roast, and I was always hunting around for him to find this stuff. And it became harder and harder. Like you had to go in New York to, know which store tended to keep some in stock and stuff. And until I read your book, I didn't realize that was kind of to appeal to more of a mass American audience.
I mean, they were losing taste tests and they were basically losing taste tests to the most insipid kind of blends. And so the crazy thing is, right, they create that Pike Place blend, which is named after the very first store, which sold dark roast beans.
Yeah.
That was the middling. They basically leveraged their own history to create a kind of Dunkin' Donuts like brand.
Yeah.
And I think that, they realized that they had lost you in some ways. If you were really going for coffee.
Yeah, I wasn't buying it for myself.
Like there was Joe's, there was all these alternatives in New York, right? If you were really committed to dark roast coffee.
Yeah.
But to the 1 million tourists that were visiting New York every day who didn't want to seek that out and who had basically a kind of bland conception of what coffee was, that was a bigger market for them.
Yeah.
And they I think that the better coffee, the coffee story was kind of a lost leader. It could be up on a wall, it could be in a pamphlet. You just had to make that claim to have enough coffeeness that you were sort of better than Dunkin' Donuts.
Right.
And that allowed you to sell frappuccinos, basically, right? It was that coffee knowledge that you could leverage to the higher priced drinks. But like they got rid of the coffee makers that used to be in the stores. They weren't doing cuppings anymore. It just wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was easier to open one store in Rome, get a bunch of publicity, let that sort of trickle down a little bit and move on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I so appreciate the book's fascinating on many, I will say to listeners, it's well worth reading just for the stories about retail, Starbucks as retail therapy. I mean, it's really great stuff. But in terms of understanding how Starbucks certainly made the term third place more familiar to people. But I hope that, we've explained that there was a bit of a miss there.
Can I explain one other thing, which I think is the most important to me? I don't know if you agree, but to me, the most important insight of that chapter is, and I'm sorry I use like some French theory to explain it, but basically, I think what happens is Starbucks comes in the larger consciousness to own that term. And they come to own our expectation of what a coffee shop is. But what that really is the promise of privacy in public. Essentially, that you have your own table and you can be in public, but do your own thing. And this sort of doubles down with the advent of the internet. So then that's what we come to expect in a coffee shop.
Yeah.
And what I would argue is that Starbucks, in distorting a notion of third place, make it even harder for us to find. It becomes the norm rather than Ray's contention. Like we're not arguing over his contention. We're arguing over whether a Starbucks store is a third place. And when that's the argument, we've lost.
I think that because Starbucks is still very much part of our lives, I think it's really important to understand this. And so thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed talking.
I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration. and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at KarenChristensen.substack.com.